Okay, recording is on. We are going to jump right in. So, we're talking about interviewing today. We start this in August, even though for some health professions, the people applying have literally not even submitted their applications. Some application services, nursing, for example, opens now. I think the nursing application opened like 2 days ago or 3 days ago. So, it is super, super early for some people, but we are looking at the big picture across the timeline for all health professions, and some professions are already sending out invitations for interviews. So for those of you either right now or watching the recording for whom this is coming super, super early, just know that you can always return to it later on when you get closer to your interview time. All right. So with that, let's dive right in. My hope is to talk a little bit about different types of interviews, different preparation strategies, and some logistics as well. And this is for the most part going to be, kind of consistent across professions. I will try to mention when there are things that might be different profession by profession. But the first piece is, this question of, okay, well, I got an interview. I know that's a good thing. But kind of what's the big picture of this whole interviewing thing? So your written application, whether you've applied through a central application service or directly to a school, your written application is the starting place for a program to do their initial assessment of, do we feel like this person is qualified? Do we feel like this person might be a good fit for our program, right? If they don't think you're qualified, like they're like, no, we don't think this person is ready to be well, I won't name a profession because that'll freak everybody out if I pick a profession, but this person's not ready to be a, X, Y, or Z. Um, or, we don't think that this person is going to do well in our curriculum. They're not going to interview you, right? So you've passed a really important screening stage, basically, once you get to this point. Really, in an interview, it's they're wanting to get to know you more, right, than they can from a written application. Um, and they also want to confirm what they're reading in an application. They may have follow-up questions where they want to learn a little bit more or clarify things. But that assessment of sort of qualifications uh is largely within the written portion of the application. I certainly won't say it entirely, but largely. So interviews, there's these bullet points here on the screen, right? That you're all seeing. The interviews are largely getting at these types of things. Um, and they're going to ask you questions that are going to be on these topics. I would say academic readiness, less so. Again, that's one of the things that often comes through really clearly in the written application. But if they have questions, they may ask more about that. But a lot of these other things, or all of these other things, definitely are going to come up in interviews. Um, and I talked, at the outset about timing. So because each profession has their own timeline, we literally could see we meaning the office. Me as an advisor, I could see people having interviews literally any month out of the year. But most in terms of who our applicants are from Mount Holyoke and the programs that you all are applying for, we see the most interviews between August and March. And I would even narrow it down more and say between, September and February is even more the kind of tight timeline of where we see the vast majority of interviews. For those who joined after I said at the outset, feel free to ask questions whenever. Both unmuting and asking your question, as well as using the chat, are totally fine. So whatever works best for you, do not hesitate to stop me or interrupt me at any point if I can clarify or go over some things. Oh my gosh, I'm getting lots of people joining. Sorry. Okay. All right. So what do you do once you get an invitation to interview? There's kind of some first steps pieces of that. So assuming you want to accept the offer, especially if this is your first interview, you probably want to accept the offer, right? If you've already been admitted to a preferred program, but maybe you just hadn't withdrawn your applications from other programs. But if you're in a situation where you've gotten an offer and you're saying, well, I'm not, no matter what happens, I'm not going to go to this new school that just offered me an interview because I prefer the school that already accepted me. Obviously, this is a later in the cycle problem, not a now problem. But if you're in this situation, you can decline the offer, and probably at that point, you're obviously withdrawing your application if you're declining the offer to interview. But if you are in that circumstance, you may want to consider what other schools you want to withdraw your application from, just for their sake. That's slightly a different topic, but just as an FYI. But again, assuming that this is an interview that you want, a school that you still want to be considered by, accept the offer. And I always encourage people to select the earliest time slot that's possible for you, which may not be the earliest that they have available, but the earliest one that you can do, because so many of these programs are using this rolling admission process. And the very latest interviews, often those people, the schools have filled their classes and they're interviewing for the wait list. And so you have a greater chance of admission if you're interviewing earlier. Again, that's not universally true, but it is often true. And then email Jackie. So you can certainly CC me, but Jackie manages setting up mock interviews, and she manages, the whole recording of where people interview for data and record keeping purposes. So she's really the most important one to email at that point. Let her know that you got the invitation to interview, and she can schedule a mock interview with me. So let me pause there and just explain. Our general policy, it's not a rule, but it's generally how we do things, is that we will do one mock interview with you per interview type. And we're going to get into the different types of interviews. But there's three broad types that we can do mock interviews for. And so traditional interviews, asynchronous interviews, and MMIs. And again, we'll talk about those. We can't really do a mock interview for you for a group interview type. Doesn't really work. But with the three others, hypothetically, if you got an interview invitation from different schools, each one using a different interview type, we are more than happy to do three mock interviews for you so that you can practice each one of those types. We do not typically do multiple mock interviews for the same type of interview. And that's really just both an equity and a capacity thing, that I need to be able to have time on my schedule to do mocks for everybody. But multiple mock interviews for different types, absolutely. We will absolutely do that. So let Jackie know, mock interviews are an hour. They are not available to see in Handshake. You won't see that type. You're going to ask Jackie to schedule it. She's going to ask you about when the interview is so that we can schedule the mock interview at an appropriate time, not too close, but not too far away. And she'll ask you the type of interview at that point so that I know what we're actually preparing for when we do the mock interview. That bullet point of MSAR, DO Explorer, PAEA program directory, those are just some sample examples of places, that can give you information about interviews and interview types for different schools. Hopefully, when a school invites you, they're giving you a lot of interview details. Sometimes that doesn't come until you've scheduled it. So the databases can be useful tools if you need to get a little more information early on. Okay, so a couple other early things that you can do once you've gotten that interview invitation. Make sure you're going to have a good place to do it, both the actual interview and the mock interview. If it's an in-person interview, obviously you're going to go to wherever you're going. But if it's virtual, you're going to want, a quiet space. And so if you're on campus, there are interview rooms at the CDC that you can use if that's helpful for you. And same thing for the mock interviews. Like if we're doing a virtual mock interview, which most of them are at this point, most interviews are virtual. And we're not going to do that in my office. Even if you are a current student on campus, we're going to practice your virtual interview virtually. And so you can use the rooms at the CDC for that as well. If it's in person, start planning your travel, right? If you're going to need to travel any sort of distance, just to make sure that you know how you're going to get there. If it's something you need tickets for, that you can get those, working out accommodations, costs, all of those things you want to do. Obviously, some real good advanced planning for all of that. And then you're going to start doing your actual prep for the day of the interview. And And there's a link there. The slides will be available as usual, but there's a link there to the interview section of our website. It's also, just for those of you who can remember the parts, there's that section called Parts of the Application Process. There's a section within that about interviewing. A lot of information is in there. So, we're going to talk about some different types of interviews, what you might expect, what these different words and names of interview types actually mean. So there's first of all a type of interview in the sense of whether it's virtual, where it's happening, basically the format of it. And I mentioned these in my examples before, but we've got these asynchronous video interviews, which in name are, of course, virtual. And the asynchronous piece, right, you're not doing it with another person. So these are interviews that are going to be through some type of interview platform. Kira Talent is one that a lot of schools are starting to use. So it's a company name that may come up. It just means that that's the company that manages the software that the school is using for this type of interview. And so they give you pre-recorded questions, and then your responses are recorded, usually brief responses. In some ways, it can feel a little like an MMI in the sense that it's strictly timed in terms of the amount of time that you get to think about the question and then respond to the question. It is not necessarily like the MMI in terms of types of questions, right? So an asynchronous interview could be any type of question under the sun, depending on how the school is choosing to use it. But they're usually fairly brief, and you do them on your own time. The school will give you a deadline to have it done, and it's just something like a situational judgment test kind of assessment where you just get it done on your own time. So then there's virtual live interviews, which is, you know what that means, right? And then there's the in-person interviews, which you also know what that means. And like I said before, we don't see that many in-person interviews anymore. Depending on who an applicant is and where they're applying, hypothetically, there could be an applicant who only has in-person interviews, depending on your profession and which schools you're applying to. But at least in terms of the applicants we work with and we have been working with since COVID, the vast majority of interviews are still virtual. Schools switched to that during COVID out of necessity and found that they liked it for a variety of reasons. So that is most likely what you are going to find. Now, I'll get more into virtual in another slide, but while I'm thinking about it, I will just mention, virtual is nice because you can be anywhere. You do have to pay very close attention to time zones if you're really going to be very far away from wherever you're interviewing. So just keep that part in mind if and when you get there. And then for the live interviews, so asynchronous is just, it is what it is, and there can be different types of questions, like I said, but the structure is the same no matter what. But for the live interviews, we could have traditional style, multiple mini interview, group interviews. And honestly, a lot of schools have started to really merge all of these things. You might have a school that does a short asynchronous video interview as sort of a screening for everyone, and then it invites certain people for a live interview. You may have some schools that definitely don't use the asynchronous piece, but that are kind of merging a day of interviews that has some MMI style, some traditional style, or merging traditional and group. It's just every school kind of decides what they want to learn about applicants through the interview process and what's the best way to do that. Um, I will add a piece because I talked about doing different mocks with me. If you get an interview invitation where they're doing both traditional and MMI in or a combination of asynchronous and right, if there's some kind of combo, um, but it's just one interview technically for one school, we could still potentially do two different mock interviews for that. I think we just need to talk about it and figure out what's going to be most effective for you. But we're not going to automatically say, oh, it's just one school, so you only get one mock interview. If they're really legit doing two different styles, yeah, we'll practice two different styles. So again, you want to find that out before you make your mock interview or schedule your mock interview with me so that we can really schedule what's going to work best for you. Okay, so Before I go on to the next slides, which talk more about the traditional and MMI styles and the asynchronous style, just a short note on MD PhD interviews. We have more MD PhD applicants this year than usual, which is very exciting. But just so that you all know, which you may already know, but usually those interviews are over 2 days because you are interviewing for two different programs, really two different degrees, one program, but it's basically two interview processes, even though you're being invited for, one interview for the program, but one day for the MD portion of it and one day for the PhD portion of it. So those are going to be longer commitments, even when they're virtual. Just to add that they still need the time to get all the different interview pieces in. All right. So getting into the types a little bit. And again, feel free to pop questions either into the chat or just ask them. So I talked a little bit on that other side about the asynchronous interviews. And I think that I actually did cover a lot of what's here. I didn't mention that sometimes there's some like a written component here. It says questions can be presented in written or oral form. Um, in theory, like with Kira Talent, they can also ask for written responses. Based on what I've heard from people who have done these, because I don't know what every single school is doing, and I'm not aware of any resource that shows us that, unfortunately, short of going to every single school's website. But some schools may ask you to actually write some responses. But I've mostly heard people, mostly or all heard people just doing the oral responses to the questions. But they can present them in written or oral form. Um, I think actually I covered all of that because I talked about it on the other side, so I don't have any other comments on the asynchronous interviews. I don't find that they're super common. More common with some professions than others. We have an alum. Well, some of you met her, Dr. Hanif, who was the dentist who was one of the evaluators for the mock MMI back in the spring. So some of you did some interviews with her, and she's been involved in admissions and interviewing through the school that she went to. And she, in some email exchanges, was sharing that she's seeing the asynchronous platform come up a lot among different dental schools. I'm not seeing it so much among medical schools, for example. But things change year by year, so you never know. So traditional interviews are kind of what the vast majority of people, I think about when you think about an interview, right? Where you're sitting down with a person, maybe two people, that can vary, sometimes as many as three people, even who you're sitting down with, although that's not technically considered a group interview, which I can explain in just a second. But you're sitting down with, one or a couple people, and they're asking you questions, and you're responding to questions, and you're asking them some questions at the end. And sometimes it can feel a little free flowing. That's the traditional interview style. I will, as an aside, because I don't have a screen on group interviews, just say group interview in this case, I think it said on the previous slide, the group part, it refers to a group of applicants. So with a traditional interview, when you may have two or rarely, but three interviewers, that's still a traditional interview in name, right? Um, so things to know to find out about your traditional interview. And again, a school, hopefully, oops, sorry, hopefully is sharing this with you up front. But if not, these are helpful questions to ask, things to know before you do your mock interview and finish your preparations. Obviously, the format, virtual and person, is hugely important, and they will tell you that right off the bat. Open or closed file. So what this means, in a traditional interview style, different schools will make different choices about what degree of information from your written application they are going to share with your interviewer or interviewers. Um, some schools, the interviewers read the whole written application. Some schools, they read none of it. Some schools do something in between where they will let interviewers read your personal statement, for example, or they let them see everything except your academic metrics, GPA, MCAT, classes you took, Sorry, not just MCAT. That was very med school focused. Entrance exam, GPA classes you took. Great. It just depends on the school. So as with so many things, I feel like I'm such a broken record saying this, but it depends on the individual school in terms of what the interviewer is going to know about you before they're actually sitting down with you for an interview. I will add that it probably doesn't make a huge amount of difference in terms of your preparations, whether it's open or closed file, but I think that internally it can be really nice to know so that when you're going into something, you know whether someone has read everything in your application. That's a different context for having a conversation with that person versus someone who literally knows nothing about you from the outset. So if they'll share that information, I think that can be nice to know. Um, so what do you do, right? Different tips for preparing. So definitely review your own application. It's helpful to know what it is that you wrote, and in that open file style, the interviewer may actually use information from your application to form some of their questions. Tell me about the, I see you did this. Tell me about that, or what was your experience with? So they're really pulling directly from the application. Um, and then obviously review anything that they sent to you, right? Make sure that you're very aware of all of the details of what they're telling you about the interview itself. And then also, this is where you do a second, hopefully, deep dive, because the first came when you wrote the secondary application, assuming that the school had one. Your second deep dive into learning about this school. Because if you think back to that very first slide, one of the things that they really want to assess in the interviews is fit for their program. And so you should go into this interview so excited, so thrilled about the school, so engaged with what they're doing and what you've learned and what more you want to know, right? It should be palpable. They should feel your excitement and your energy coming from you when they're talking with you. And so part of that is you bringing that energy, but part of that is you, again, really engaging with the school's materials and getting to know them so that you can have that confidence when you talk with the person or people from the school. Um, Another piece, so that's all very concrete, right? Here's some really concrete stuff that you can read over, review, think about. Less concrete, what do you want them to know about you? There's a strategy to this because you don't know what they're going to ask you, right? Questions are confidential. After you have your interview, don't share the questions, right? That's how interviews work. But um, So you don't know what they're going to ask you, but you can think about how you want to present yourself, how you want to kind of tailor the things that you might say, in order to highlight what you want to highlight. And without thinking about it beforehand, that can be really hard to do because you'll be nervous. Right. Some people will be more nervous than others. That's totally fine and normal. But everyone's going to have some degree of nerves going into an interview. And so that preparation, of kind of knowing what you want to bring to it can be really, really helpful and grounding. And then thinking about what you want them to know, and then think about what are key experiences that you've had that can be really good examples to support these things that you want them to know about you, right? And that show what it says there, who you are and how you approach different situations. So if you think back to writing your essays, whether you're still working on it now for those who haven't yet applied, or whether you did it and you submitted your application, but if you think about the essay writing process, or even just writing essays for school, right? I mean, it can be anything. You know that concrete, specific details and evidence strengthen your writing, whether it's academic writing where you have to give evidence for your ideas, whether it's more personal writing like your personal statement, and you're giving examples. It's so much stronger, right, than just saying, I'm a compassionate person. You have to show it. Show, don't tell. Well, the same thing's true in the interview, right? Just saying something about yourself is far less meaningful and convincing, and honestly doesn't really help them get to know you, even though you'd think it does, but it really doesn't. They need the examples. So brainstorm examples, because again, in the moment, if you're nervous, and they say, "Oh, tell me about a time when you," I can say made a mistake because I used that as an example with someone earlier today. Tell me about a time you made a mistake. And in the moment, you're like, "Oh my God, I have no idea what to say." But if you've thought about key experiences, then it's going to be a little bit easier to bring that up in the moment. The next bullet point, I will, give my caveat here that this may be more important for certain interviews than for others. Depending on the school you're interviewing at, depending on the profession, how much emerging issues in healthcare may come up as a part of the interview can vary. But I can confirm 100% that it absolutely is out there in interview land. There are absolutely questions that are going to ask you to either pick a topic that you want to talk about, or they're going to pick a topic and ask you to talk about it. Um, and this is not the kind of thing that you sort of try to all of a sudden become an expert on. Unless you already are, you won't be that, and that's not the point. The point is that they want to again just sort of learn about you and how you're thinking about these things. And they also want to know that you're, an aware and informed person who's not ignoring current topics within the field that you want to go into. So if you're not already doing it, find some things that you like to read or podcasts that you like to listen to if those are getting you this type of content, and just kind of do it over time. Keep yourself up to date, keep yourself informed. Again, not don't cram, don't try to study, but just keep up with things that you're interested in. And then prepare to ask questions. So, in a traditional style interview, you will almost always be given the opportunity to ask some questions of your own, of your interviewers. Ideally, they're going to leave some time at the end for you to do that. And not only is that a great gift to you to be able to ask what you want to ask and hopefully get some helpful information, but it's also kind of part of their interview. And so having questions prepared so that you know for sure you've got stuff at the ready, um, is in a sense part of your answer to their question, right? Of what questions do you have? And prepare more questions than you think you need. Because sometimes what happens is an interview day might start with, let's say, an information session, or there might be a lunch with students, whatever the the schedule of the day is. If your actual formal interview is at the end, it's possible that certain questions you had might have gotten answered earlier. So prepare, or it might have gotten answered in the course of your interview. So prepare more than you think you need, just so that you've got a bunch of the ready. Sorry, I lost my little zoom. There it goes. Okay. Actually, sorry, I'm going to back up. I just want to invite, are there questions about traditional interviews? Anything that I didn't go over about that interview style or preparing for that interview style that would be helpful? Okay. It's quiet and I have no chats, so I will move on, but happy to come back to it if questions come up. Okay, so a lot of you participated in the mock MMI back in the spring, and even one or two of you participated in the one that we did in 24. So you've gotten some, and some of you, if you're a reapplicant, may even have done a real MMI. So I know a lot of you have experience with this already, which is fantastic. Some people don't, and it can be um, it can be a lot of new stuff with this interview style because it's really not what people traditionally think of when they think of an interview. So briefly, because I don't want to bore the folks who totally know all of this, but the MMI, right, stands for multiple mini interview. It's not used in every profession, and some professions it's used very, very sparingly. It's really pretty common in for medical schools. S- Relatively common for vet schools. You can see it for pharmacy, dentistry, PA. Those are the big ones where we really tend to see it. Um, So multiple mini interview in the name, multiple and mini. You have multiple short interviews. It's done in a station format, so I often call it like speed dating for interviews. Each station it has a different evaluator and a different prompt that you're responding to. The exact number of stations, the exact amount of time in each station varies depending on the school and how they've structured it. But if it's in person, oftentimes you're literally like in a long hallway and you're just moving from room to room, a whole bunch of applicants at once, just sort of doing this circuit around different rooms all simultaneously. If you're doing it virtually, same thing, simultaneous. It's just virtual breakout rooms rather than actual physical rooms. Um, a lot of people, when they think about it, can feel really stressed because it feels so different and like a lot with doing all these different interviews. A lot of people find that they enjoy it though once they do it. It can be kind of a fun way to interview. And one of the nice things about it is that, well, two, because there are so many stations. First of all, you have a different evaluator in each one, so it's lots of different opportunities to impress people, right? And to show lots of different people how great you are and why they should admit you. But also, it means that you kind of get to hit the restart button every single time, right? And so if there's a station that, let's say, you didn't feel as good about, yes, mentally it can be a little challenging, but if you can just sort of push that off to the side for a little bit, you can just, okay, boom, restart because this evaluator in this room knows nothing about what I just said in that other room. Um, so lots of different opportunities. And then the way that the MMI is scored is each evaluator gives you a score and they take all that information and compile it. So again, if there's like one real outlier, that's not going to have as big of an impact on you as an applicant than if that outlier was actually your only interviewer, right? So there can be a lot of benefits to the structure. Okay, so there's different types of stations, and I'm not going to go too much into this in particular because there is a whole other shorter recording that I made in preparation for the mock MMI. Some of you have already watched it. There's a link to it at the end of this presentation, and it goes through in more detail the MMI different types of stations and prompts and preparation suggestions, resources, all of that. And on the slide at the end here, it also tells you where you can stop because part of that presentation was about our actual mock MMI event, which nobody needs to listen to at this point. But these are some four basic stations. So a question or a prompt to respond to. So you read something, you think about it, and then you give your response, your thoughts, and or your answer to the question. There are stations that actually give you a scenario where you role play and you're interacting with an actor, someone who is there to actually pretend to be your patient, for example, or your colleague, or whatever the scenario might be. Um, there can be a task to complete, and I have heard that schools have managed to do this virtually as well as when they were doing it in person. So you might be given something to do with another applicant, for example. And then they can also put in really different types of stations, like a traditional one where it's more of a conversation, like a traditional interview, but it's still short. There can be a writing station, there can be a rest station. So it really can be varied. But I would say the greater number of stations is likely to be that first bullet point where there's a question or prompt and you respond to it. And that's the one we really practice in the mock MMIs as well. I can't practice you doing a task with another applicant. It's not, worth our time to do a practice writing station. So in mocks, we really focus on the first type. And then again, some tips on the MMI, but there's a lot more in the other presentation. You want to really take your time when you read the prompt. Most of them are not super long. Sometimes they're a little longer. Read it through a couple of times. Think really carefully about what is this actually asking me, right? MMI prompts sometimes have red herrings in them. Not everyone may know that phrase, right? But something that's designed to throw you off the scent. And so you want to make sure that you know what is it asking me? And hey, there's this other juicy tidbit in here, but that's not actually what the question is. Doesn't mean you can't discuss that juicy tidbit that may also be in the prompt, but make sure you answer the actual question of the prompt, right? Do what they're asking you to do. Um, and listen well. That's more if your evaluator has follow-up questions in some, or when you're, working with another person or doing a scenario. In some stations, your evaluator really just listens and that's it. And it's just you talking, but that can vary. Um, some of the things that come up as questions, there's different advice out there about whether in the MMI, when you go into a new space, should you introduce yourself? Because presumably they know the circuit, they know who you are or who should be coming into their room. Whether you should introduce yourself and whether you should summarize the prompt that you've just read, because again, they know what the prompt is. Um, my feeling is yes on both counts. I think that it is socially appropriate to introduce yourself. And part of an interview is being socially appropriate and friendly with people. And so I say yes to that. I also say yes to the prompt summary, even though sometimes it can feel a little bit silly. But I think it just, if you think about organizing your thoughts and your presentation of your response, I think that can be a helpful way to start. Here's what I'm responding to. Also, with longer prompts, it can help to clarify how you understood it, right? Your summary clarifies that for the person who is evaluating you. So that's my opinion. I say yes on both of those counts for the MMI. Um, like I was talking about before with, right, those concrete examples, things that strengthen your argument, same thing holds true here. Be specific. If you make a general statement, follow it up with specific examples, details. It is okay to share from your own experience when that's relevant. Just because MMI questions are not specific to you, the question itself is not specific to you, right? Because it's a prompt that everyone in the circuit is going to answer. It doesn't mean that you can't bring yourself into the response if that is relevant to the response. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And so you'll decide that, but it's perfectly acceptable to do. And again, can help to add some of those details where it is possible. This next bullet point sort of reads weirdly, respond appropriately to the person in front of you. All that means is that, again, even though this person's your evaluator and sometimes just sort of sitting there like just listening and not really reacting, there is still a person there. Um, and also, again, the scenarios or the task to complete, there is a sort of interactive social piece there, or professional piece if it's a scenario where, like I said, someone's pretending to be your patient or whatever. So that's part of those stations as well, is that the interpersonal skill element of it. And then be prepared for ethical questions and unfamiliar topics. You may get presented with a question on a topic that you have never thought about before in your life. And what are you going to do with that? You've all of a sudden got 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes to talk about something that you've never thought about before. And so part of practicing for the MMI is running through lots of random questions that you're just picking out of a hat or having someone throw at you, or however you're doing it, so that you can start to think about, okay, well, what am I going to do in the moment when I'm presented with something that I haven't thought about before? How do I approach that? And while in our remaining 20 minutes here we can't get super deep into that, I will say in mock interviews together we can really talk through some of those things that might be ways for you as an individual to manage that type of situation if it comes up. I did get a question in the chat. So I was talking before about I recommend introducing yourself, and this question asks whether it's important to introduce yourself at the beginning of the Kira assessment, which, like I mentioned, Kira Talent is that company that's doing a lot of these asynchronous interviews. I would say no, because it's just a different structure. There's not that social component, right? You're speaking to the camera and you're recording an answer. Um, you can, I will put it that way, right? If you're the asynchronous interviews will be just a few questions. They're, as I said before, relatively short. As part of your answer to the first one, you certainly could say, you know, hi, my name is so and so. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Nothing wrong with doing that. But because of the structure and format of those asynchronous interviews, I it's not as relevant or important, I guess I would say, as when you're actually face to face with someone, whether it's virtually face to face or in a room face to face. Okay, and just at the bottom there, there's a book that I recommend. It is you're not going to find it in your local bookstore. So, it's the kind of, or your library probably. But it is, I found it really both accurate in terms of my own experience and research, on the MMI structure, as well as thorough and informative. And there's other online resources. It doesn't have to be a book, but I happen to have read that one. It's not super long. It's an easy read. I do have a copy in the office for those of you on campus if anyone wants to, when you're back on campus to swing by and take a look or even borrow it right there. I don't mean borrow, loan out. I'm not planning on loaning it out. But you can certainly sit in the CDC library and read it. Um, but anyway, I thought it was useful. Okay. Oh, I'm gonna do my same thing. I forgot, like with the asynchronous. Any MMI questions before I move on?
If we participated in the mock interview in April, would you recommend us scheduling an additional like mock interview with you if you were to get an interview for an M&A?
I do. Yes, absolutely. And the reason for that is because the mock MMI in April was great practice for doing the questions and for doing it in a way that's going to be closer to the actual one because it was an actual circuit with strangers and all of that. In a mock MMI, though, it's just you and me. It's just the one-on-one. It feels much less like the real thing because of that. But we also kind of slow it down and stop in between each one and can talk a lot about strategy and structure of responses and things like that. We can kind of get into things that we didn't do because of the format of the mock MMI in April. So I do recommend that. Nobody, by the way, this is a good question for me to sort of tag on here. Nobody is required to do a mock interview with me. That's, just like, committee letters or having me review your application materials or anything like that. This is all just things that are there as options for you and for us to support your process. So it's your choice for sure. But it will be different than the April mock MMI evening. Good question. Any other MMI questions? Okay, so we'll move on. But again, feel free to go back if new questions come up. Okay, so those were those, two really common interview styles, or three. I guess we talked about the asynchronous. I forgot that part. Three common interview styles. So now we've got the actual prep, right? So there's like the logistical prep, and then there's a practice prep that we were talking about. So virtual interviews, I put this on before in person because, as I've said a couple times, it's really the most common. So you're most likely to get this type of interview, or if you have multiple interviews, to get more of this type of interview. Sorry, my little Zoom thing's in my way of my words. Um, so a few tips. Try to practice on the same device that you're going to use for your interview. That might not be possible, and it's totally not the end of the world if it's not possible. But kind of like prepping for your entrance exam, the more you can do that's similar to the real thing, the more that's going to help you and just help you feel comfortable and really well prepared in the moment. Um, Plug in your device when you're doing your actual interview for sure, right? I think that's general advice that folks know at this point. And if it's, if you have to do it on hopefully not a phone. That's going to be hard for you, but a phone or a tablet, if it's any kind of handheld device, remember to turn it horizontal so that they can really see the full screen of you and not just that thin little strip. But a computer is best. And again, I will make a plug for the interview rooms in the CDC. If for any reason, if your computer breaks and it's being repaired or you need a new one or whatever, and you're like, oh my God, I'm without a computer. And you're on campus, you're more than welcome to use that CDC interview room. There's a computer in there ready to go for you. Just FYI. Obviously check the tech requirements really carefully, right? Just make sure that you are totally set up, do it well in advance so that if there's anything that you're going to need to adjust or change, that you're going to have the time to be able to do that. And again, I'm not pushing anyone to use the CD, or I don't intend to be pushing anyone to use the CDC rooms, but just mentioning that that's set up there for you. So if you choose to use one of those rooms, you're not going to have to. Yes, you should be aware, but it shouldn't be a concern, unless we have some critical Wi-Fi failure, which shouldn't happen. Um, so private distraction-free space, right? Find what's going to work for you. If you're off campus and home doesn't work, is there, a reservable room at your workplace or a public library? So, think about the space that's going to be available to you. It's really important for it to be really private and quiet, right? You don't want noise in the background. You don't want people in the background, both for the sake of being professional, and sort of how you are presenting to your interviewers, but also for your own sake, to just not be distracted by anything. I'm in my home right now, actually working from home today. And before I started this, I said to the other people who are here, do not come into this space while I am doing this presentation. It will be too distracting. And this is not my interview. So that's a really important piece. Think about your camera position. So this is something that I feel like, at least for me, I never thought about before COVID happened, and all of a sudden we were doing way more professional online stuff than we had ever done in the past. But you want to, I mean, we've all seen it at this point, right? There's ways to look good on a Zoom screen or whatever the software is, and there's ways that don't look so good. So a couple of the tips: make sure that your camera is up, right? Right now, mine is actually a little below my eyes for an interview. Ideally, it would be, up here more. So make sure it's up at your eye level. Make sure that your, full face is in the frame, kind of like, the way you see me right now. Um, Close your window shades because you don't want that random glare coming from the side or the sun moving, sort of changing the lighting over time. If you put a light behind your screen on your face, that illuminates you so that they can see you really clearly. You definitely don't want to be backlit, right? And then make sure that nothing on your computer is going to distract you. Any other applications, notifications, etc., anything that you need to do to just keep the focus on the interview. And then just my personal tip. So, as you know, with Zoom, like you can close the self view so that you're not seeing yourself, and should be able to do that with pretty much any software. But if the interview software doesn't let you turn off your self view, you might consider putting a post-it note or something over your own face, just so that that's not a distraction, because you want to be talking to your interviewer and not distracted by your own face over there in the corner. So that's just something to think about depending on how the software works. I mentioned time zones before, right? Make sure you're early. If you're someone who has a hard time being on time, make sure you're extra early. Know yourself, and do whatever you need to do, to make that happen. And then dress. So, I talked about how, again, like you can see me, you're only seeing me from shoulders up, but I really strongly recommend that, like, head to toe, you are professionally dressed for your interview, your virtual interview, both so that they don't accidentally see your sweatpants that are, below the screen, but also because there is a psychological element to being dressed up, being in your professional best, that I think is important in this high stakes interview. So for your own sake, I really encourage that. Head to toe, hair, makeup, jewelry, whatever you as a person do, think about all of it. And make sure you're comfortable. So that's obviously really important as well. Solid colors, again, that's my recommendation, just based on talking to people on Zoom a lot. You want them to focus on you and not be distracted by anything else that's not you. So a lot of prints can, I'm hesitating on the word distraction. For me, it literally like draws my eye away from the person's face. So that's why I recommend solids, or at least things that are sort of I guess toned down, maybe just so that the eye isn't drawn to it, because you want their eyes drawn to your face and not to your clothes. Um, Same thing with the jewelry and everything. Everything should just be your style, but also making sure that the focus stays on you, and that they're not distracted by anything else. A big one for me, again, a lot of these recommendations come from me just seeing people in different situations over the years. Do not sit in a chair that moves. If you sit in a chair that moves, this comes up a lot in mock interviews. You're going to be in your interview doing this, right? If your chair swivels or rocks or whatever, it's really hard to not have that happen. I do it in my office sometimes because my chair is a swivel chair and rocks and all that. But you don't want that in an interview. That again, it gets very distracting for the person watching you when you're like swaying back and forth. So make sure that you have a stationary chair if you can. I mean, if you can't, then you're just gonna have to work hard to try to keep yourself still. Um, a question that I get a lot is, do I need to look at the camera? Right? Because we all know where the camera is located. I bet sometime in the future they're going to figure out technology that changes this. But where the camera is located on your computer is not where the face of the person you're talking to is located. So I have different opinions on this depending on the style of interview. When it's asynchronous, when there's no actual human there, and you're just making a recording, I do recommend that you look at the camera, because why not? Right? You don't need to be looking elsewhere. And when you're watching a recorded video, so on the other end, it is noticeable when someone was looking right at the camera, as I'm doing right now, versus when someone was looking down at the screen, which I'm doing right now. And again, I don't know if you're, totally noticing that on me in the moment, but over the course of a recorded video, it definitely becomes noticeable. Um, on the flip side, though, when you are talking to a live person, I think socially, it's really hard to have a reasonable conversation with somebody when you're staring at a green dot at the top of your screen rather than looking at their face. Um, and I think that the difference in that more social situation is negligible enough, and that we all have gotten used to video conversations enough that it's perfectly okay to look at the person's face rather than staring at the camera. One thing that you can do if you want to, and you can record yourself sort of testing this out and see how it looks, is again, if software and your screen and everything allows, if you wanted to sort of minimize the screen to a slight degree so that the person's face is slightly raised up to the upper portion of your screen, it'll bring your eyes up a little bit. But that might also feel distracting because then it's a weird small shape. So that part's up to you, but those are my personal recommendations. Again, I would say to try these things out, right? Test it out, record yourself, or record someone else doing it, however you want to do it, but see how you feel about it and how different things look. This is just it's a very short video from this, professional photographer or something giving tips on looking good on a video. Any questions about virtual interviews? I just checked the time and it's a little later than I thought. So I'm going to move on. Okay, so in-person interviews, you may get one, you may get none. Some similar recommendations, like dressing professionally, right? Difference is with in-person interviews, you have to especially think about the climate and the weather where you're going to be. You will almost certainly have some sort of a tour if you're going for an in-person interview. Make sure you are very comfortable walking around in your shoes and your clothes. And again, that you're dressed appropriately for whatever the weather may be in that location at that time. So AccuWeather is your friend. And also in person, you have to think about what you will carry with you. What do you need to have with you for the day? And a big thing for me in recent years that I've become more attuned to in our office in particular is strong scents. Some of you know that Jackie is very, very sensitive to scents. And so it's something we've become more aware of. And so just like we were talking about video distractions, you don't want a strong scent to be a distraction for someone who maybe is very sensitive or even allergic to certain scents. So be conscious of that when you go into your interviews, and think about, do you use perfumes? Maybe you don't use that, or keep it. It's hard to keep perfumes minimal, in my opinion. They're designed to be strong, but also highly scented shampoos, lotions, etc. Just think about that in terms of how people who maybe are sensitive might respond to that. And then what you carry, don't carry a lot. You certainly don't want to be lugging around a big, huge bag, and you got to make sure you have a professional looking bag that you can use. Um, but my big things are think about what you need to keep you comfortable for the day. So, like, are you someone who's going to, on a bathroom break, want to brush your hair? Have a small brush with you. Are you someone who is prone to having a dry throat and want to have a cough drop with you, just, in case you need to pop something in your mouth? Whatever. Tissues, little tissues, that's another big one for me that I think about a lot. Whatever is going to help you to sort of comfortably get through the day, whether you end up needing it or not. And again, without going overboard, think about those sorts of things. Being early becomes in some ways a little bit more, maybe not more needed, but being early when you have to travel, you gotta maybe think about even a little bit more. Know where you're going. If you're close enough the night before where you can maybe do a dry run to make sure, if it's a place that you're unfamiliar with, to make sure you're not going to get lost. That's a great strategy. Tuck your phone away. Your phone should just be out of sight, out of mind. At least silenced for sure. If you can turn it off, I personally think that's even better. It's less of a distraction for you. You're not going to be tempted to sort of pull it out and check things when you're, in an off moment, because there really aren't any off moments. Even when they give you some downtime, right? This is a break. You're not off. It's still your interview. It's still your interview day, and you want to be totally present and engaged. I recognize, particularly saying this as a parent, that we cannot all, in every circumstance, turn our phones off. I do get that, but just be conscious of it. Okay, so wrapping up because we're 1 minute away from 1 o'clock. This is really the end piece, which is the practice, right? And a lot of this I went through, but some tips for practicing. I talked about the mocks with me. So looking at some of these other things here, do a lot of practice. That's one important thing. There's no substitute for practicing. It'll help you feel more relaxed, more comfortable, more prepared, and by extension, do better. Right? It's really, really helpful and important. Try practicing with different people, but practice on your own. You can't always have another person with you. So practice on your own as well. Big Interview is a software that Mount Holyoke has I guess it's called a subscription or whatever for. It's kind of like the asynchronous style interview, but for practice. So that's something that you can use. Try it out, see if you like it. If you hate it, don't use it, but it's there for you. Um, MD, PhD applicants getting some practice with folks who are in research. That's obviously a really sort of niche area, different from the other things that we've been talking about, but obviously critically important for your interviews. So make sure that you get some of that practice as well. I think that's really, I covered the other things on there. So just a couple final things before a mock interview with me. So you're going to schedule the mock interview, and then before it happens, there's some general interviewing tips from the CDC that it's great for you to review, and then some specific to health profession schools that I'm stealing from another school's website, but they did a really great job. So that's on there. Tips from the AAMC, particularly those of you who are medical school applicants, and then there's sample questions. And I told you there'd be this link to the MMI presentation, and it tells you can stop at, basically half an hour. The stuff after that was about the actual structure of the mock MMI, which you do not need at this point. So those are we encourage everyone to do those things and do some preparation before your mock interview. If you come to me at your mock interview and you say, Katie, I haven't done any prep at all, that's fine. We're still going to do your mock interview, and I'm still going to like you. So don't worry about it. But it's helpful. It's helpful to do a little practice before we actually get started with it. All right. I used up all our time. If there's any, final questions in the moment here, go for it. I will, wait for a little bit right now to see if anything pops into the chat. But in the meantime, I will also mention that as usual, as you know, this was recorded. The recording and the slides I will post on the website today. That's my plan, actually. So they'll be there really soon, and I will send out an email to all applicants once those are there.
What happens if they only have like one day for an in-person interview and there's like conflict? Do they only have one day or will there be options?
That's a good question. It can vary. So in the best case scenario, you are given a couple of different options and they are at least a couple weeks away from the day when you've been invited. And I would say that is the majority of cases, but not always. Every now and then they're trying to fill a spot, right? Someone dropped out and they're like, "Hey, we have an opening. We want you at this time," and it's tomorrow. Usually it's not tomorrow, but it could be the day after tomorrow. So things like that do come up. If you really can't make it, like there is absolutely no way that you can make the time that they're offering to you, but you really want to interview with the school, it's perfectly reasonable to see if there's any wiggle room and let them know how excited you are, how much you would love to interview, but that you have an unavoidable conflict that just can't be changed. Are there any other possibilities? And you see what they say, and the worst they say is no. And then you can see again if you can change your conflict, and if not, then you have to make a decision. But most times they'll give you more advance notice and choices.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I see also your question about whether they're usually on a specific day of the week. The answer is usually yes for the school. In other words, a lot of schools are going to be like, yeah, Friday's our interview day, or Monday's our interview day, or however they do it. But for you as the applicant, not necessarily, because different for different schools in terms of how they do things. All right, so we will wrap it up there. Thanks everybody, and you're welcome. I saw a couple thank yous come into the chat. And just a final reminder in case you didn't see my email, I am out next week, like totally out. I will, as far as I'm aware, be without Wi-Fi and cell access and all of that. So you will not find me next week. Jackie will be in the office, however. So if anything comes up, you're welcome to reach out to her. But also, if you've anything urgent, last minute questions that you need to know right now, shoot me an email like ASAP, and I will get back to you before I'm gone. And then I'm back on August 25th. So it's just next week that I'm going to be out. All right. So we'll be in touch, and I know it's not quite the weekend, but almost. So have a great weekend.